I expected my daughter to give me a hard time about the length of this study, but not Eric Cole. That was not in my bingo card. Turn to 1 Corinthians 16. We will finish the book today. And to go ahead and let you know, we will not be going into 2 Corinthians. We will go into 1 Peter, which is a shorter book, starting next month, which means we'll only take 2 years to get through that letter. Couple of quick announcements before we get into the lesson. We don't normally do this, but we felt it important to make these mentions. We've recently had 2 families, if you will, come back to us, and we announced one of those, but they weren't here, and that's John and Carol Williams, and we are just super excited to have you guys back with us. And also Linda Taylor is back with us, and we are so excited to have Linda back as well. And it's always good when folks come home, and we've had that happen with a couple of people in my time, and just to say welcome home, and we're so excited to worship and work with you together as we serve God. My first line in my outline is that this is undoubtedly the happiest sermon of Jameson's 17 years of existence. And just so for the record, it's been just a little over 3 years and only 28 lessons in that 3-year time, which is less than you realize or think, because it just so happens that almost all of the Mother's Day, Father's Day, holiday kind of things end up happening near the second Sunday, and this is the sermon that kind of gets punted. So it's not been 37 lessons, it's been 28. But we began this study in January of 2022, and we end it today. And our focus was, at the time, and still has been, to see how culture impacted the Corinthian brethren in the church there. And we look at this letter as a letter of problems and divisions and issues. And it was. And a lot of this letter, and even I think the beginning of this letter, was in regards to another letter that had been written to Paul, and he's answering them back. And he's letting them understand and know some things clearer. You might remember that phrase, now concerning about the things which you wrote. It shows up a lot. And even here in verse 1, it says now concerning. It seems to have the same theme. And we looked at these different things and how even their pagan past had crept back in. For instance, the issue of meat offered to idols has to do with their previous pagan heritage and going back with their friends to eat to what amounted to them, by the way, in their view, probably more of a restaurant than anything else in our common application today. And yet Paul helps them grow and see what is important there, and that eating the meat's not a problem, but if you're worshiping a pagan god, that would be. We see their divisions following men goes back to their heritage as Corinthians, as it was common for them to follow different philosophers and teachers, almost like we follow NFL teams or NCAA teams, that they would support them. They would financially support these teachers. And so when you see them following Paul or Apollos, it's the same idea. They've just brought their culture in with them. We have seen them really rely on the class system of the day. The idea of those who are noble and those who are rich and those who are poor and those who are servants, that impacted them. Even the way that they're partaking of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, when it deals with it, a lot of that had to do with the haves and the have-nots. And so that's a cultural impact as well. And so we've seen all of those things in the context of this letter. And we've also noticed that we face some of the same challenges. Maybe not the idea of going back to a pagan temple or this system of the haves and have-nots in the form of slaves and rich, but we are drawn by our culture. We are lured away from God to think about the flesh more often than we should. Our relationships that we had previously to following Christ, or maybe even the relationships we have currently but are outside of that fellowship, they lure us away, and they cause us to try to want to be more in the here and now. And I think one of the reasons why he really ends with chapter 15 being the last real meaty section. It's kind of this theme of here's all these problems you have, but get back to what matters, which is the resurrection in your future and the certainty of what is to come in eternity. And this idea there where he tries to explain to them that as they are sowing the seed of their earthly body that will reap the body to come in 1 Corinthians 15, to think about that. And so then he comes to the close, and really and truthfully, chapter 16 is not very meaty. There's not a lot of depth to it, a lot of meat to it, in other words. And there's some important things, but there's also just some things like verses 5 through 9 that have already been read for us that are just, it's just kind of Paul telling them his travel plans. Hey, here's what I plan to do. I'm going to come and see you guys. I don't want to just kind of stop over for a night. I want to be able to stay longer, so I don't want to come now if the Lord will permit. Now, what is interesting, by the way, is 2 Corinthians is written because essentially his plans don't work out. He doesn't get to come immediately and stay a long period of time. He makes a short trip from Ephesus up there, not even the way he planned to come, and then he goes away from there. He will come back to Corinth for an extended period of time. But that makes up a lot of this letter. But if you're like me, the number one reason, if you grew up in churches like I grew up in, the number one reason you ever turned to this chapter was the first 4 verses. And it's about the collection for the saints. And it's an interesting passage based on how it's been used by many in my lifetime and why Paul writes it. Because I'm just going to warn you that I don't think those two things are equal. If you're like me, you grew up with a similar background, and since COVID, our practice has changed, but pre-COVID, we passed the basket, if you will. We passed the plate around to ask for funds. Always was odd to me, by the way, that we would have these statements that were associated with that I almost thought were included in 1 Corinthians 16, like separate and apart. It's not in the text, by the way. I don't know if you've noticed that. But the other one is there's no solicitation. This is no solicitation of funds. We'd always say that and then shove a basket in the visitor's face. And so it's always been kind of interesting, some of those practices. Since COVID, we've gone to, what we just call box on the wall. And the people that are members know where that box is. And if you're not a member, it's not really important. And you might think, well, that's weird. And I will tell you it's weird for us. Maybe in some sense it's become our normal. But if you go back and look historically, that's what they did in the first century more than likely. In the court of women, there was boxes that were located every so often for the support of the temple. In the synagogues, they would do the same things. We have no reason to think that suddenly when they began following Christ that they started passing Jedediah's hat around for the collection of the funds. And so we might have, by the way, reverted back to what is historically the more established practice. But back in the day, if you will, I think I can say that now that I'm older. Back in the day, they used to get up and pass these baskets, and it would be something like this. Somebody would say, in 1 Corinthians 16, Paul commands us to lay by and store. And we proof texted this for the weekly contribution. And the reason I find that interesting is because I don't think these verses are about what we call the weekly contribution. And I'm going to challenge our thinking a little bit on this morning and make sure that we understand why that is. But the collection here in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 is a specific, special, uncommon collection, meaning it's unique. It's for a specific purpose. I do believe it is in addition to not necessarily a weekly collection, but in addition to the funds that would have been collected for what we would call the work of the church. Now, we'll talk about in a moment that idea of the church treasury. Paul here, before he gives these travel plans, he does do this now concerning phraseology. And you might go, well, why did he wait till the end? Well, this is the end of the letter. Paul's about to say, here's my plans to come see you. And what he's saying here is, when I come see you, I want to pick this gift up that I'm going to instruct you about. He saves this for the end because he wants to save it to the travel arrangements. When I come to town, make sure you're ready for this moment, for this thing. And so those are the instructions here. Let's read that again, the first 4 verses. Concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you are also to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside, store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. In verse 4, he names the focal point of this gift. It is Jerusalem. And that helps us to understand that there is a specific need in question. It is quite possible that, and by the way, I want to make sure we understand that this need is not for the greater Jerusalem. This need is for the Jerusalem church. It is for the brethren there. And we read up to chapter 8 or 9 in Acts, and we see that there's this vibrant church of thousands of people who are so benevolent that people like Barnabas and even Ananias and Sapphira, though we know what happens with them in chapter 5, they're selling their property in order to financially support other people. And so we read that and we think about their vibrance and their benevolence and their love for one another. But then we have the scattering. And what happens is those thousands of people that have kind of accumulated in Jerusalem, they scatter from Jerusalem and go back home and go across parts of the earth. And in the process of that, Jerusalem becomes a much smaller group. But then over time, they begin to financially struggle. There's a couple of possibilities for that. One of those is the loss of the members. One of those could be that in the process of supporting so many people, they put themselves in financial hardship in the long run. But overall, what we know is those who remain are what we would call facing poverty. They're poor. They are not in as good a standing as other people. By the way, this is referenced in Galatians chapter 2. In verse 7 starting, it says, on the contrary, when they saw that I'd been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry of the circumcised, worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they go to the circumcised. Verse 10 is important. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. And what most people will tell you is because these 3 people are focusing on the Jewish brethren, and specifically in Jerusalem, it seems, that the poor here are the ones in Jerusalem. And they are struggling here. But this is also just more than helping the poor that Paul is trying to accomplish. It's more than benevolence. It's something that N.T. Wright described as momentous, because even Paul was anxious about how this was going to be received. In Romans 15:31, he says, I may be delivered from the unbelievers in Judea, and my service for Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints. And do a lot of connecting, and we kind of connect all these things together. So what is Paul doing if it's more than just giving money? I think the big part is found in Galatians and then carried over here, and that is simply this, that Paul is trying to help all Christians of all backgrounds, Jews and Gentiles, understand that they are all one. Here is this church in Jerusalem that is suffering, and he is writing to these Gentiles in Galatia and in Corinth, and no doubt in other areas, and saying, these are your family that are hurting. You have a responsibility to help them. And so he is trying to ensure that these Christians from this background realize their responsibility, but at the same time, and I hope we'll see in a moment, he's trying to help the Jews understand that the Gentiles are their brethren as well, because they love them and are delivering this gift to them. It's interesting to remember that in Galatians chapter 3 and verses 25 through 29, that there Jesus talks about that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. And then he says in verse 29, if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. And Paul is saying that to Jewish and Gentile Christians, that all of you become Abraham's offspring. To tie back to our class earlier today, all of you are the fulfillment of Genesis 12 and verse 3. That through Abraham's seed, all of you would be blessed. The interesting thing to consider here as he does this to strengthen their unity is actually, and I'll give you a moment to do this, to fill in all of this, the process by which he wants to do this. And I got to tell you that until recently, until a couple studies of this, I don't know that I realized some facets of the process listed out here. Because again, all we did was proof text to say, hey, you need to bring your money on Sunday. And we missed some of these things that are here. So the process as it's laid out, not all of this is in your outline, but first they are told to put aside funds weekly. Some suggest, by the way, that this isn't putting aside funds to the church as much as it could have been even at home. You set aside at home in this savings account, if you will, an amount of funds so that when I come, you bring me what's in your savings account. And I think we assume naturally that this is some collection that happened at the building, but that's not really what the focal point is. What it is here is that these members are supposed to take what amounts to several weeks, maybe longer, to set aside an amount in addition to what they may be giving to support the work at the church in Corinth, to set aside this amount so that when Paul comes, there is this larger gift, a gift that could be larger than if he just had a 1-week special contribution. That's the idea here. And then secondly, part of the process is everybody was supposed to participate in this. Paul didn't just say, hey, those of you that are rich, make sure you lay by something aside. It was to everybody. He says, each one of you, every single one of you. There's no hierarchical structure. In other words, if the widow only had 2 mites, Paul did expect her to give the 2 mites. That's what we're talking about there. Everybody was expected to participate. Thirdly, they were to give as they were able to give. And so there's the expectation that if you are rich, what should you do? You should be able to give more than the widow. There's that expectation in these verses. Someone who couldn't give much wasn't expected to give much. But someone who could give was expected to do. I'll remind you that in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul writes to Timothy there and tells the rich to use their wealth on earth in doing good to others in order to lay up for themselves treasure in heaven. And by the way, that's not that phrase, while it's the same way Jesus uses it in Matthew 6, it is not used in the same way. In Matthew 6, Jesus is talking about that where you find your value and importance reveals what your heart is. But in 1 Timothy chapter 6, what the focal point is, the way you use your earthly blessings has an impact on your eternity. And so that's the idea here. And then here's the part that I don't know that I ever really fully understood till recently is they're supposed to choose representation from among themselves to carry this gift. I think a lot of times I just honestly just thought, well, they're just giving Paul an envelope of cash and he's going to walk it over to Jerusalem. But what he says here is for them to choose people, and if they think it's appropriate, he'll go with them. But if not, they can take it by themselves. Why would he do that? Well, first off, there's a sense of ownership here. This is coming from the church in Corinth. But I tell you the other thing is, this makes it clear to the Jewish brethren in Jerusalem, here come these Gentiles with this gift for you. And this is about fellowship and unity. This is about Paul making sure that when the churches from Galatia or the churches from Macedonia or Corinth or wherever, when they brought this financial assistance to the church in Jerusalem, Jerusalem understood who it was coming from. It was coming from Gentiles. Now I want you to imagine for a moment being people who left behind the law but still had a lot of clinging to the law, so much so, and the covenant from the Hebrew Bible, so much so that when you come to Jesus and you see these Gentiles coming to Jesus, your thought is they've got to be circumcised like I do. And they've got to keep the law like I do. And there's been this tension, and Paul's been writing and teaching and saying, no, that is not what happens. And maybe you're really adamant about that, and they're not my brethren, and you're barely able to eat, and here they come, and next thing you know, they're the reason you can't eat. You see how that changes the understanding and the unity and the nature of the church. And we say all of that to say that this was what we might call today a special collection for a special purpose. You know, it kind of be like, what if we, in Mozambique, and we're blessed to have the funds, I think, to help do this, but there's been a really bad tragedy over there of natural disaster, right? And so we've been able to help with that. But if we didn't have that, it would be like us sending out an email and saying, hey, Sunday, we're going to take up a special collection for the saints in Mozambique. You know, and we want you to be generous in your offering. That's the idea here. And so one of the reasons I want to take the great pains to kind of explain all of that is just so we know exactly what the context of this is. In other words, this passage really and truthfully is more about fellowship and unity than a weekly contribution, and about God's people taking care of God's people in love. And that's what we need to understand. And you might say, well, what about the collection? Well, let me just say real quick, and I just want to go through this real quick. There is an evidence that is there beyond this of an existing, what we would call a treasury or a bank account or funds. And I didn't put this up there, but that even exists with Jesus and the disciples prior to the establishment of the church in Acts 2. Judas in John 12, he's the money bag holder. He's the one that carries the funds that people have been giving to them to help the poor. And even in the explanation, you know, Judas says this should have been sold, this ointment should have been sold to help the poor. And it explains to us that he really wants to extort the money from the bag. But that helps us understand what the money bag was for. It was to help the poor. Well, we come to Acts 2, we see that early on in Acts, where we see the church selling their possessions. We see Barnabas doing that at the end of Acts chapter 4. We see Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5 doing that, even though they lied about it. Think about Acts chapter 6, where here 7 men are chosen to take care of the needs of the Greek widows because they've been neglected. Again, one of those things that I think you kind of, as you get older, you understand. As a child, when I saw this idea of waiting on tables, in my mind, it was like an ancient Meals on Wheels program, right? That you had these 7 guys loading up hot boxes in the chariot or the wagon and delivering money, or not money, but food, hot meals, 3 times a day to the Greek widows. And I just got to tell you, as you dive into that doesn't seem to be the idea here at all. Tables is the same word used for bank. And it seems more likely that what these deacons are doing is they're just administering the financial aid to the Greek widows so the Greek widows can do what they need to do to eat. It wasn't so much about delivering an ephah of flour and of olive oil. It was about what we would call even a monthly stipend financially, and making sure that this sister, this widow, gets her monthly stipend. That seems to be what the context is more about. Well, what does that require, by the way? Well, it requires some kind of existence of what we would call funds, bank account. That's what that is. By the way, I will tell you this about Acts 6 that I find interesting and about this whole thing is years ago I was at a church that the elders dealt with all the benevolence, and we had it was a rough patch in one of the kind of recession times, and we had about 3 or 4 or 5 meetings in a row of dealing with benevolence that kind of consumed them. And one of the elders, been an elder for about 30 years, and he sat back and he said, what can we do so we're not always meeting about these benevolence causes? And I said, we could do what they did in Acts 6 and let the deacons take care of it. Because, by the way, that's why these men are chosen. So the apostles don't have to deal with it. They can focus on praying and teaching the word, and that's what elders should do as well. But the money has to be there. And then even 2 Corinthians 11:8, when you think about, Paul talks about the Corinth, he's not going to rob other churches, or he robbed other churches to work among them rather than take money from them. Well, what that implies is churches have this fund. They've got money. And so what I'm saying to share with all that is, noticing that 1 Corinthians 16 is not about a weekly collection for the work of the church doesn't mean there's not some kind of a collection for the work of the church. It just means that's not what that passage is about. And it's important that we need to understand the distinction, the differences of that. And the reason I tell you that is because we claim to be Bible people that do Bible things in Bible ways, but sometimes we explain things in ways that aren't biblical, that just deny the context. And we do that because it's our heritage and our tradition. And I challenge us on those things just so we don't become the new Pharisees that pass down traditions as the commandments of God and as doctrine. And so just think about those things. Now, all of that probably got us sidetracked about what we're here for, but it's important to kind of understand. And besides a couple verses we'll look at in a moment, that's probably the most meaty thing here, because then what we see now is just Paul has this kind of laundry list of closing remarks. We're just going to breeze through those real quick. But for instance, he has these travel plans. We've already talked about that here's what he's planning on doing. He wants to come see them. It's not going to be for a brief visit. He wants to make it an extended visit. That doesn't work out, but those are his plans when he writes this letter. He then gives instructions about Timothy and Apollos. He talks about here in fact, in chapter 4 and verse 17, he tells them that Timothy has been sent to them. And here he is telling them how to receive Timothy, that they are to receive him in a way that puts him at ease because he's doing the work of the Lord. Verse 11, let no one despise him. Help him on his way in peace, that he may return for me, for I'm expecting him with the brothers. And so he is making sure that these, and we've talked about this, these proud, arrogant, sophisticated Corinthian people don't look down on Timothy, this minister. And don't mistreat him because he doesn't measure up to what they think he should be. Paul's endorsing Timothy and saying, make sure you assist him and take care of him and support him in his work rather than to be a hindrance. And then he moves on to Apollos, who has been a central figure here in the book because he is the one who kind of is Paul's competition in the mind of the Corinthians. I am of Paul and I am of Apollos. And even though that Paul mentions Cephas and Jesus, it seems to be that the two that are the real big division are between Paul and Apollos. And later on, when he talks about 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when he talks about the idea of God giving the increase, you remember Paul planted and Apollos watered. And so they are the two major figures in this work. You think about it, it probably can't help but think that those two might be at odds with each other. But here Paul says in verse 12, I urged him to visit you with the other brothers, but it was not at all his will to come now. He will come when he has opportunity. What is Paul saying there? You all may think we're at odds, but we're unified. There's a lot of unity going on in this text here. You may have put us as competition, but we are in fellowship. And then the house of Stephanas in verse 15 through 18, urge you, brothers, the household of Stephanas was the first convert in Achaia. They have devoted themselves to the service of saints. Be subject to such as these, to every fellow worker and laborer. Be subject to every worker and fellow laborer. This is the same idea in Ephesians 5 and verse 21 when he says we are to submit to one another. That's the idea here. I rejoice at the coming of Stephanas, Fortunus, Achaicus, because they have made up for your absence. They refresh my spirit as well as yours. Give recognition to such people. So he and two other men from Corinth have come. They visited. They're going to return back. And he is thanking them for allowing them to come. And then the closing, where he says that the churches of Asia greet them. Here's a mention of Aquila and Priscilla together with the church in their house, sending hearty greetings in the Lord. We know that the church met two different times in the house of Aquila and Priscilla. One was in Rome and one is in Ephesus. And Paul is in Ephesus when he writes this, and so we can assume that's where he is. Greet one another with a holy kiss. If you have questions about that, see Joe Smith. He'll give you an exhortation about the holy kiss. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. If anyone has no love for the Lord, let him be accursed. Our Lord come. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with you. My love be with you all in Christ Jesus. And so we have this greeting. We have Paul saying, even if some had helped him write the letter, the way this concludes is that he is signing the letter, that he is the one who's saying these are his words, and he is signifying what is there. Now, you might go, well, wait a minute, you skipped a couple of verses, and I did, because I wanted to end with that. And it won't take us long, but I view verses 13 and 14 as Paul's final charge to the church. That he has said all these things, some 15 and a half chapters. How do you wrap up? How do you leave it? What do you say at the end? And this is what it is for him. It's been compared by some commentators to the orders that a general would give to his troops as they're about to enter into battle. And certainly there's some kind of feeling to that, because he starts off with this idea of be watchful or be on guard in verse 13. Be watchful, be on guard. This is about vigilance. They had lowered their guard and allowed the Corinthian culture to influence them again, and the Roman culture. They had allowed the division to come in among them that existed away and outside of them. They had allowed things like immorality, if you remember the story in chapter 5, to come in and to influence them. And so he's saying here to be watchful against sin and to be watchful against temptation and influence, to be watchful about the way that you are treating one another and how that you let your culture define you and treat you, to be watchful against false doctrine and self-centered religion. All of these things are covered in these 15 chapters before this one. And so he's saying there, be watchful, be on guard against these things. What do we do with all this stuff you wrote about, Paul? You be watchful. You see the dangers that are out there in these things, and you watch and you warn against those things. Take these instructions and put them into practice and prevent these things from occurring anymore. Secondly, stand firm in faith. This is not, by the way, fighting for our doctrinal convictions and making sure that the group down the road knows that they're different than us. That's not what this is. This is a commitment to live your life in a way that is consistent with your faith in Jesus Christ. And they had failed in that. They had given in to the lax moral standards of their culture, and they tried to fit in with the world around them rather than to conform to the image of Christ. And that changed who they were. And so he's telling them, don't do that. Stand firm in your faith. You're going to be attacked. These two words are military terms. Be watchful and stand firm. Why? Because the world's going to keep coming after you. Satan is not going to quit just because I wrote you a letter. It's up to you to take the letter and cause yourself to live in your faith. And then he says in verse 13, act like men and be strong. By the way, I'm sure that would be inappropriate and politically incorrect today to say act like men. But the real idea here is to be strong and courageous. That's really what is being said here. And this idea of being strong and courageous, that should cause maybe some bells to go off in your head. You might remember that is a common phrase, not just in the days of Joshua, but specifically at the end of Deuteronomy, beginning of Joshua. Moses and Israel tell Joshua to be strong and courageous as he leads them into this land. And we even sing songs with those words in it. Be strong and courageous. Paul's own experience, by the way, of how he's been mistreated, how his faith has cost him. His own experiences are proof for the need of strength and courage. Even back in verse 9, as he talks about his travel plans, he has some hesitancy about how he'll be received, some adversaries that will be present and that may harm him. And so if they're going to be watchful and stand firm in the faith, if they're going to be good soldiers, they're going to have to be strong and courageous in the process. Now, if that was enough, I think that's a final charge, right? This is what you're supposed to do. But then he ends with this thought. But do everything in love. It's so interesting that these first three things are kind of, I think, sometimes how we sum up the Christian life. We're under attack. We've got to be watchful. We've got to be firm in our faith. We've got to be ready to fight. We've got to be strong and courageous. We're soldiers of the cross. Put on your armor daily. Get ready to go out and fight the devil and fight the world. And it's almost like this idea of spiritual bloodshed. And then he says, but make sure you love everybody. This has been a motif in this letter. 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 1. Concerning food offered to idols, we know all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, have not love, I'm a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, if I deliver up my body to be burned but have not love, I am nothing. And even the letter ends with what? Verse 24. My love be with you all in Christ Jesus. What do you think he wanted them to take away from this letter? Oh, sure, stand firm in your faith. Live your life as a believer and make sure your life as a believer mirrors Jesus. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, he wrote. But what's the best way we can imitate Jesus? Love. Love. And even the instructions about the collection were about what? Love. Above all else, love one another. It's kind of interesting to study for 3 years to get to something we should have known already, right? Love each other. But that's the closing message of the book. Years ago, you've heard me tell this story about a mother. She had 3 boys. 2 of them are elders in the Lord's church. One of them is on death row. And I would take Peyton to her house. She could barely see at the time. She was in her late 80s. And she, as long as she could make the trip, she went to visit her son in prison. But Peyton would go. She had no TV really. Her wall was filled with books. I think she had a small TV in the corner for the news. But in the bottom center section of the bookshelf was the toy. Every grandma has a toy cabinet somewhere, right? So Peyton would go and he would just drag all the toys out of the toy cabinet. He'd play in the floor. And I would sit there with Nan Duggar. And she would tell me, she would say, no matter what he does, make sure he knows you love him. Well into her 80s, she would go visit her son on death row. You know why? So that he knew she still loved him. Love covers a multitude of sins. Above all else, love each other. I love you, even if it took us 3 years and 28 lessons to get there. But I hope that this study has been a benefit to you. I love this song. And I'll tell you why I love this song. And then I'll let Caleb come lead it. This was my dad's favorite song. How can I live tomorrow? because Jesus lives. Let's sing.